Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. It's me, your host, Riley Lewis. Happy Monday, by the way. I hope you had a good weekend, a restful one. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today, so let's just jump right in. So, our first story is coming to us courtesy of The Washington Post, which I know I frequently talk about, but frankly, that's because they're one of the big players in media right now in the mainstream media. So, this is an article coming to us courtesy from The Washington Post, which basically is detailing what we're seeing more broadly in the media, which is that we're finally getting back to covering coronavirus as far as the news is concerned. We took a few weeks there where we weren't really covering coronavirus because we were covering the protests, and we can talk about sort of the interesting dynamics about not talking about the coronavirus spread and the pandemic during the protests specifically because of the protests. But in any case, we're basically back to a place where we're actually talking about coronavirus. Once again, coronavirus has the spotlight like it has for almost all of the year. We're actually over halfway through 2020, which is crazy. Can't wait for this year to be over. Now, again, I specifically want to point out that we're seeing a spread nationwide. Now, mainstream players like the Washington Post, like Vox, like BuzzFeed, they're going to mention names like Texas, like Florida, maybe like Louisiana, other states where they're basically run by Republicans because that basically suits their political agenda, which is to say that states that opened soon because they were concerned about the economic disruption and the economic disaster were really not doing it wisely. And it's hard to say if that's because people are concerned about public safety or if that's because people are concerned about compliance and obedience. But in any case, you're really only hearing Texas and Florida being mentioned in the mainstream news. But the reality is that on the ground, this is happening nationwide. In fact, Los Angeles County alone has more reported deaths than Texas does right now. So this is nationwide. We're seeing this in Washington State, we're seeing this in California, we're seeing this in Florida and in Texas and in New York, where Andrew Cuomo has actually talked about a second shutdown, which I do not think we can afford. And that's really the big question right now. Can we afford another lockdown? I don't think that we can afford it. I think that so many people would be driven back into poverty or would just be absolutely just completely displaced. I mean, people wouldn't be able to pay their rent, their mortgage, pay for food, pay for their student loans. I just think that we can't completely shut down the economy and give people one check for $1,200 again and expect that to be the same. So in any case, just to come back, we're seeing a rise in cases, at least reportedly, in all states. I mean, most states nationwide. Certainly states that have been opening. Now, again, it's interesting because certain states like Texas opened all the way as early as May 1st, and we didn't hear anything really for the entire month of May. George Floyd is murdered May 25th. We don't hear anything for another couple of weeks because of protests. Now we're finally hearing something 6 weeks later. So you can see the delay from the actual time of easing the restrictions in these states, by the way. Additionally, there is, again, some sensitivity about the subject because, again, clearly weeks of protesting, rightful, I understand in many ways, but still, weeks and weeks of protesting where tens of thousands of people are literally just shoulder to shoulder, mask or no mask, is definitely partially responsible for the rise in number of cases, but we're not allowed to know that, and the mainstream media won't report that, specifically because people who are actually conducting testing have been ordered by officials such as Governor Cuomo to not ask people who test positive whether or not they've been at a demonstration or a protest. So given that information in that context, it's really impossible for us to know how much of this is the result of weeks worth of incessant protesting. I suspect it's very much responsible for the rise in cases. In any case, our governor from Texas, Greg Abbott, has agreed that he eased lockdown restrictions too soon, again dating all the way back to May 1st. However, we did not start hearing about this rise in cases until the end of June, nearly 8 weeks later. My point is, regardless of a demonstration, a wedding, a work event, large gatherings right now are not wise because we're in the middle of a pandemic and that's how the virus spreads. And I think that the sooner we put off just a short, swift intense lockdown, then we're going to have to keep dealing with this. I would have liked to have seen 4 to 5 weeks of intense lockdown, and then basically the virus is done, and that's it. We've killed it off. There's nowhere for it to transmit anymore. But getting back to this article, which mentions Texas and Florida, two states that were early to ease the lockdown restrictions. Now these states are cracking down on some of the obviously reckless activity, albeit you could argue, right? I mean, obviously people are saying stuff like their individual rights and the Constitution, but in any case, there's been some reckless activity, absolutely, especially among younger people, and this has caused the virus to spread, frankly. We have young people who are living understanding that honestly, yeah, the chances of you getting sick in a very harmful way are lower if you're younger, so people are taking more risk, and that spreads the virus. So essentially, I mean, it appears again that the virus is spreading because large groups of people are not following proper health guidelines, which includes wearing a mask and even physical distancing. The article goes on to say, quote, both states are backtracking amid a crisis of rising hospitalizations and skyrocketing infection rates. Texas Governor Greg Abbott ordered bars to close and restaurants to reduce occupancy, and he gave local governments authority to ban outdoor gatherings of more than 100 people. The changes came as statistics show 1 in 10 Texans tested as positive for the novel coronavirus, and the state's largest hospital is at capacity in its ICU. So clearly, when 10% of your state population is testing positive for it, that might have something to do with more than just a few people, or I should say, there's something bigger going on, obviously, when it's as high as 10% of your state population, at least according to this article from the Washington Post. Now, quote, the article says, in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis ordered bars to close immediately Friday because of widespread noncompliance with rules regarding capacity and social distancing. The surprise announcement came as state and health officials reported a record 8,942 infections Friday. Average cases are up nearly 77% from a week ago, which is absolutely crazy. And some of this is for sure absolutely about the fact that we're just increasing our testing capacity, but some of this for sure is about our own reckless behavior. And both of those things can be true at the same time. Maybe we were right in some ways about masks. Now, I will say, one of the stranger things that sort of attached to this coronavirus, again, is the reopening process. That's something that's always been like a sidecar to this coronavirus issue. And it's something that the media really has been incredibly inconsistent about. They've sent tons of mixed messages, and they don't want to admit it. And to be honest, I understand because this is very complicated, and we have journalists covering this, not people who, I mean, sometimes we have actual doctors, but in many cases we have journalists, not virologists covering this stuff, and it's very difficult to get this stuff completely right. In any case, we've had a mixed bag of answers, basically, from media stations that are regarded as mainstream. So, and this has really been difficult for Americans, especially for the 20 million people, for example, who filed for unemployment in the United States in April alone. And again, this has been very even frustrating because, on one hand, if you demonstrate your concern publicly about the economy, people boil it down to you're just selfish and you want a haircut. But if you gather in the streets for weeks with signs, shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of people, then you're not allowed to be concerned about the virus. But now we're back to being concerned about the virus. So it is frustrating, and people don't really understand what they're supposed to think at the end of the day. And I think what's really likely is that going to bars, going to restaurants, and demonstrations and public gatherings of all kinds in the last 4 months, especially in the last 4 weeks, have greatly contributed to the spread of the virus, at least if what we are being told is true, which I want to believe. In another episode, by the way, I will be sure to explore the coronavirus a lot more and compare the two competing schools of thought, the wet market hypothesis and the biolab leak hypothesis. But in any case, this country is experiencing a reported increase, a skyrocket in the number of cases of the disease, really due to reckless behavior of all kinds on behalf of all people in all different kinds of settings. And reckless in the sense means that you're endangering yourself and others. And I know sometimes people say it's worth it when there's a cause, but sometimes it's not worth it. Sometimes you have to find other new ways to demonstrate because we're still in the middle of a pandemic. And it can't be selfish when someone else wants to gather, but then when you want to gather, it's not selfish. I just don't think that that's fair. And I think that we really just need to stick to stuff like wearing a mask in grocery stores, for example, which is a really minor convenience that really helps to slow the spread. And again, this is another thing about narratives that's confusing for people. We should have been saying the entire time masks should be worn. But the reason we weren't, and we finally know this, thanks to people like Brett Weinstein, who do very hard research, thorough research, we know that originally people wanted to save the medical surgical masks for those in the medical community. So they told us that masks don't really work, so that there wouldn't be a shortage of masks for people on the front lines, which honestly I understand, but again, that's not great for building a cohesive narrative or set of standard operating procedures for the people. And so at some point, people are just wondering, are we fully stopping the virus? Am I sort of stopping the virus? When does it work? When does it not work? Mask, no mask. People want to know. Families want to know. And without dissecting these narratives, completely, it's clear that several states who were first among to open, especially perhaps under these guidelines, thinking stuff like, oh, we just need to, keep a distance and we'll be fine. Many of these states are now retreating. And it's because they've, in their defense, they've had so many mixed messages, they don't know what exactly to do. And for Texas and for Florida, for example, this means that bars will not be able to remain open for I don't know how long in the foreseeable future. People will not be able to go out and get drinks with their friends. And I certainly hope that there will not be a second economic shutdown, but I think that's on the table if people do not start behaving a little bit more. Now, some elected officials, like I said earlier, such as Governor Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, have actually suggested a second lockdown phase, which would really be nightmarish for the millions of people who are already unemployed and trying to recover right now. And I know that the economy seems like this invisible, faraway object in the forms that you just can't touch, but really, the economy is people. It's people being able to send their kids to school who depend on federal programs for hot meals every day. It's people who can't afford childcare. It's people who have to go work 2 or 3 jobs to make rent, to pay for their family, to pay for insurance, to be able to live. And when millions of people are filing for unemployment, it's really, really difficult to trust these politicians when they tell us that they actually care all of a sudden, because politicians will say we need to shut down, but then people will say, what about the economy? And they'll say, well, too bad, but then 10 minutes later they'll try to use that for their own campaign and say we need to fix the economy. And it's just not sincere, because it's the disaster that you've created, something, by the way, that is leveraged against Trump all the time. You can't be a hero if you're fixing a disaster that you created. And that's what we're seeing happen. Now, according to Dr. Peter Hotez, who is the dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at the Baylor College of Medicine, he has said, quote, all of this was predicted and is predictable, expressing his frustrations. He goes on to say, quote, given the fact we relaxed social distancing before modelers said we could do it without putting in place a public health response that was commensurate with the economic recovery. That's exactly what he's talking about. There was no exact plan for everyone, and in some ways that gives each state, yes, more freedom to create a reopening that suits their needs, but also the lack of cohesion, I think we've learned, has been quite problematic. And predictably, the hotspots in Texas, like most other states, are really in the cities and the urban regions, where there are a lot of people who are closely congregating. Now, the CEO of the Texas Organization of Rural and Community Hospitals has said the following, according to the Washington Post, quote, hospital admissions are a lagging indicator of the trouble we have ahead, meaning that we still have, this is just the summer, we still have the actual flu season coming in the fall and the winter, and we're going to have to see how the coronavirus and the actual flu overlap, and that might be disastrous. Henderson continued to say, quote, most Texans I deal with aren't even really listening anymore. They do what they are comfortable doing and suffer the consequences in some cases. And that's what people do every day, by the way. You tolerate risk. You determine how much risk am I willing to tolerate. Every time you drive a car, you're tolerating risk. Every time you get in an airplane, you're tolerating risk. Every time you eat food, you're tolerating risk. Every time you go outside, you're tolerating risk to some extent. And, in defense of the Texans he's saying that aren't listening, it's because in the beginning, at least for sure, people like Andrew Cuomo and even Nancy Pelosi were saying, go about your life normally. Bill de Blasio was even saying, go about your life normally. Just don't, this isn't a big issue. Just go about your life normally. So I don't think it's fair to chide people now who don't want to listen, because honestly, this is a boy who cried wolf problem. However, there is still, nonetheless, unfortunately, a rise in cases that we are seeing that really does undermine the last 6 weeks of recovery. And this is really happening in some states disproportionately for sure. Now, this article continues to say, quote, in the border community of Cameron County, home to South Padre Island, a summer party destination, officials have watched their cases nearly quadruple, from 569 in mid-May to nearly 2,000. 52 people have died. So clearly this is people congregating, recreating, who aren't being who aren't being as careful as they should be. Now, this article goes on to say, quote, the projections are such that we should be concerned. This is coming from the Cameron County judge, Eddie Trevino Jr., who held a news conference this past Friday. Who he also, by the way, issued an emergency order that required people to wear masks or any kind of facial coverings. And this is what Trevino Jr. had to say, quote, we need everybody to please start doing their part. Now, this is not just happening in the United States, by the way, because the coronavirus has been a global problem, of course, which originated in Wuhan. So it's interesting, how we've talked about China and approached the fact that this did originate in China, and it is likely that this may have originated in a biolab in Wuhan, in a virology lab. In any case, the European Union, like America, wants to start gradually reopening, and so Vox has reported on this, where leaders in the European Union have decided to block Americans from traveling to Europe due to concerns about the coronavirus spreading as certain European countries start to reopen and start to resume the Schengen Agreement, which says that if you live in one European country, you can travel to any other European Union country, which is actually quite fascinating. Now, the EU plans on gradually reopening starting in July, which is coming up very quickly. However, this will not be extended to American travelers that would like to travel to Europe. This is not really surprising, considering the way the American media has covered the coronavirus. I would imagine most people in Europe think that America is a disaster, but interestingly, if you actually look at our death rates, we're basically middle of the road with Europe, as far as being between 4 and 5%. So we're very close to many of the countries in Europe and the European Union that are actually starting to reopen. So in any case, this is very difficult for, this is very, where am I? 3, 2, 1. In any case, I guess what I'm saying is that in many ways the media has manufactured this thing into a much bigger, I shouldn't say much bigger, because I don't want to diminish the impact of the actual virus, but the media, if you just read the news all day long in America, you would think that this is the Black Plague that swept to Europe in the 14th century. But in actuality, this has been something that has been in many ways far more mild than we would expect, but also in some ways far more aggressive, which actually suggests that it might have been made in a lab. And if you're interested, I would encourage people to listen to the recent Joe Rogan podcast with Brett Weinstein. I'm not published or affiliated or anything, just a big fan, in which they really discuss the fact that there's some actual characteristics of the virus in which it behaves and transmits that are indicative of the fact that it may have been created in a lab or leaked from a lab in Wuhan. In any case, the media has also really chided protesters who were concerned about the economy early, but then they proceeded to go ahead and praise protesters who would burn down the same businesses that have just been bankrupted due to the economic depression. So I'm sure there are people in Europe who are sitting there thinking that any American who says the economy is really just some right-wing conspiracy theorist. Meanwhile, if people on the American left want to literally declare their own city in Seattle, the media will encourage it. And then those same people who are rebelling against the system and capitalism will make a list of demands, including pants and Gatorade and deodorant. And so it's really just, I'm sure that America just looks not very good right now to the world, but I think it's completely distorted thanks to our media, our wonderful journalists who obviously have so much integrity. In other words, the media really does make it appear that the United States is alone responsible for a virus, which, by the way, may have originated in a lab in China in which the Chinese government was literally investigating something that could be used for biological warfare. But somehow this is the United States' fault. The irony, the irony, the irony, the irony. In any case, this article from Vox written by Jen Kirby says, quote, about letting American travelers into the European Union, quote, right now, the United States doesn't make the cut. This is not altogether surprising. Europe was once the epicenter of the coronavirus, with Italy, Spain, and France some of the hardest hit countries in the bloc. By the way, those are countries that do have, at least to some extent, universal healthcare systems, and they were still overwhelmed. That's something that's interesting to understand. The article goes on, quote, aggressive lockdown measures drove down cases, and many European countries have slowly reopened. And while there have been spikes across the continent, overall, Europe's cases have declined. The US had long since overtaken Europe as the epicenter of the crisis, and unlike its allies overseas, America is now seeing a massive surge in cases in some states. As of June 26th, the US has confirmed more than 2.4 million coronavirus cases and recorded more than 124,000 deaths, according to data from Johns Hopkins University. On Friday, the US confirmed a record 40,000 new coronavirus cases nationwide. Again, nationwide. This is because of nationwide reckless behavior, largely on the part of young people. And I go out, I've seen some friends, I was recently tested and I tested negative, so I know at least at that point, I was not carrying it, which is good, but that's because I'm being safe, and I wear a mask when I go outside, and I do wear a mask when I go on a run, and I do wear a mask when I go in a grocery store or a restaurant, and I encourage people to actually do that because it turns out that even if they don't work, it's such a minor inconvenience, and if it even appears to slow the spread, that's a good thing. Even in all my skepticism, I still wear a mask. Now, Kirby continues with this piece, basically, saying, will this be a wake-up call for the United States, which I think is indicative or demonstrative of the fact that she doesn't really understand the genuine skepticism, and I think a lot of people, maybe people understand it, they just completely gloss over it, and again, they don't want to admit the fact that this is a virus that originated likely in a lab in China. This is not the fault of the United States. This is not the ultimate fault of the United States. This originated in China. Why are we not allowed to talk about that? Why is it not allowed? Why are we not allowed to tell the truth? Why is it considered hate or racist to speak the truth? Because that is the truth. And it's likely that the Chinese government may have been working and testing a virus, and it leaked. And if that is the case, even as Brett Weinstein might suggest, why are we so scared to admit that? Why are we so scared to talk about that? In any case, the article goes on, quote, on March 11th, as the number of the coronavirus cases began to tick up in the United States, President Donald Trump announced a travel ban on anyone arriving from the 26 Schengen zone countries of the European Union. Again, meaning they can all, sort of go back and forth and basically intermingle, and people can just go back and forth, and it's very easy immigration and migration process between different European Union countries. But here's what I want to leave you guys with today. The important thing to understand here is that while yes, we have agency and we are absolutely in many ways responsible for the spread, so if we can distance, if we can limit our time, in some ways, limit our time indoors, meaning actually go outside and soak up the sunlight and get vitamin D, if we can eat foods that boost our immune system, if we can actually be smart about this, then I think that we can do that. The main problem, the headline, is that the media has sent a mixed bag of messages, and honestly, so have health officials. And we don't really know exactly how this thing behaves, and even where it originated. And furthermore, there are a lot of people who all have equal levels of concerns across the board about their financial future, about their loved ones, about their own health, about their security. And that's all okay. That said, thank you for sticking around and for listening to today's episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I greatly appreciate your time. If you'd like to support me, please hit that subscribe button down below. You can't miss it. You can also visit the link right here where you can find a playlist for my daily politics podcast. You can also like this video or leave a comment in the comment section down below and let me know how I'm doing. There's also a link in the description of this video to my Patreon page where you can navigate to the page, sign up, become a member, and make a donation. You can also find The Riley Lewis Show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor FM, and even more. Thank you for listening to today's episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I will see you here again tomorrow.